Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you so much to Sam Tannenhouse. His biography of William F. Buckley Jr. is a true contribution to history, to our understanding of America, and a round of applause for Sam and his accomplishments.
Thanks a lot, Bob. Thank you. Thank all of you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I've not been at this event before, but I kind of remember, did Laura Bush start this back in the day? Yeah, okay. So it's a real privilege to be here. Talk to you again.
I almost feel like we're on the set, Sam, of Firing Line. It's not going to be Firing Line here today, at least a little bit. Sam, William F. Buckley Jr., you capture him so well in your book, the complications of this major figure in American life. But he was not just a political figure. This was someone who would sit on a chair like this on The Tonight Show. He would be on television on PBS. Help us understand, to start off, how you see William F. Buckley Jr. in terms of the entirety of his impact and his image in America.
Well, you know, it's interesting, Bob, you say that you'd see Bill Buckley, which everybody called him. I tell people this, they think I'm taking unfair liberties with my subject. The people who worked in the mailroom at National Review, the magazine he edited and which you worked at for a time, called him Bill. He insisted on it. But it's interesting you mentioned The Tonight Show, because you can go on YouTube, see Bill Buckley on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, and the first thing he does is rattle off many sentences in Spanish, because that was his first language. And one thing that set Bill Buckley apart, not only from other conservatives, but from other political creatures, we'll call them, is how wide and broad and diverse his interests were. He wrote novels, he wrote literary memoirs, he was a sailor, he was a skier, he was a pretty good pianist. He just had many, many interests, and that's what made him an exciting person to be around. And it was a charisma that he had that you felt in his presence just the way we're talking now, face to face with him. You felt it on television. And he had that impact on the huge figures of his time. So we look at two of the most famous conservatives and made the modern movement really essential. Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona and a guy from California named Ronald Reagan. And they were in some ways disciples of William F. Buckley. So taught them how to think, how to argue, how to be bigger than just politicians. And that was the thing he brought to it.
You mentioned that Bill Buckley could speak Spanish. Can everyone hear us just to make sure? Great. That he spoke Spanish. Some people, when they first encounter Buckley on television or reading his column, they would think about the person who wrote God and Man at Yale, and he would seem maybe to be like a Connecticut Yankee. But your book takes us back to the history of the Buckley family, and it's anything but traditional.
It's absolutely, some would say back in the day, it's what they would call un-American. His father was, well, his father was from South Texas. His father, William F. Buckley Sr. Bill Buckley was the sixth of 10 children. And anyone who is in a family, been a sibling with a lot of other siblings, or is a parent with a lot of siblings, knows the rivalries and healthy, not always healthy, but often healthy competition. And Bill Buckley was someone who was always trying to stand out. He was the middlest of middle children. So his father was from South Texas. His mother was from New Orleans. They were Southerners, and they were Irish Catholic. Father was Irish Catholic, the mother was German Catholic. So although Bill Buckley grew up in very much, as you say, Bob, Yankee patrician Connecticut, what's called the northwest corner of Connecticut, right near the Berkshires in Massachusetts, they were really like displaced Southerners. And that's where a lot of the politics and also the personal style came from. If you listen closely to Bill Buckley, you'll hear there's a kind of slowness in the way he spoke, kind of languor, I call it. That's a Southern quality. And that shaped the politics as well, as you know, a lot about. And, but it also made him a bit of an outsider. So even when Buckley went off to Yale in the late 1940s, where he gathered the material, as it turns out, for his first book, God, Man at Yale, which may be the most important book to come out of the modern American conservative movement, published when he was 25. He was a huge star on campus, what they used to call the BMOC, the big man on campus. He still wrote as a critic of it. And so he had a kind of detachment and distance from that high society patrician elite, even though he was a part of it. And that's a really rare combination. So when we look around at figures today, sometimes we'll see bits of that. There's some very bright guys from the Ivy League who were in the Trump administration, but they don't seem to have that same Ivy League kind of polish that Buckley had. And so it created a kind of exciting dynamic that carried through all his life.
Sam edited for some time the New York Times Book Review. He's written many acclaimed books. You're a reporter as well as a biographer, and the reporting side of you really comes through in this book. You delved into archives. You tried to figure out Buckley has this Southern history with his family in South Carolina. And you discovered, it seemed, not only does it inform our understanding of Buckley, but it raises new questions.
It does. Buckley had an enormous archive at Yale University. He was a graduate and famous / notorious alumnus. But there's a second family story that, as you say, is in Camden, South Carolina, which is kind of the middle of the state. It's not on the coast, Charleston. It's closer to Columbia, South Carolina. And his Southern-born parents lived in an antebellum mansion there in the 1930s and 40s. Bill Buckley, who will turn 100 in November, and you'll see the postage stamp that has his likeness on it. It's coming soon. Grew up really divided between North and South. It was in the archive of Camden, South Carolina, that I found really the biggest discovery I made. As you say, Bob, as a researcher and reporter, and that is that the Buckley family, at the same time they were sponsoring Bill Buckley's great political journal, National Review, which was published in New York City, were also the sponsors of a segregationist newspaper in the South during the first phase of the civil rights movement. That meant they were vehemently opposed to ending Jim Crow segregation in the South, and which is kind of mind-blowing today, but I really tried to make people think about it. It was not so unusual a position in those days if you were from the South. I don't say it to defend it, just so we understand it a little better. So when I went down there and looked at the archive, I had inklings. You mentioned doing reporting, because you're right, because that's what I take pride in. Is yes, I try to write good narrative history, good storytelling, but it's based on the research and reporting I do. So I went down to South Carolina, having a feeling there was something in those archives, of which the family had donated to the local library. And I said, since the kind of history I write involves a lot of newspaper reporting, because then you get the details from the time. I said, whoops.
You want to bring that up a little bit?
Bring it up?
There you go.
Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah. I wanted to look at the local newspaper. And they said, sure, but you must mean the second newspaper. And that was the one his family owned. No one had ever bothered to look at the back issues, not even the people who worked at the archive. It's on microfilm. Those of you who've done research remember the days, and there's still older archives materials on microfilm. And I started reading it, and I thought, OMG, this is a white Citizens Council newspaper. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Citizens Councils, they were called the Uptown Klan. They were the opponents of black freedoms and black civil rights who dressed the way Bob and I are today. They didn't wear hoods and robes. And they controlled the local economy. So if you were on the wrong side, you could pay a price. And the Buckleys were privately running this newspaper. They didn't tell anybody about it, except in the South, it was very well known. So I realized Buckley looks different. The movement looks different, the conservative movement, and maybe the Republican Party looks different. Maybe this is really the beginnings of it. But here's what made it complicated. This is why these books are so fascinating to write. At the same time, I'm going through this newspaper and looking at articles warning against the dangers of, you can't see my air quotes, race mixing and things like that. I interviewed somebody who's, as a young child, had been part of the black staff who worked for the Buckley family. They said the Buckleys were the finest family in town. They treated everybody equally. They were generous with their wages. When the winter season ended, they made sure their black employees were paid anyway, or they brought them back north. And so this man, Edward Allen, became my friend. He's now 90. He said, every day I walk past the Buckley house, I think, thank God for the Buckleys. Thinking, wait a minute. They're publishing this newspaper, and you admire them? And then I thought, that's where the story gets complicated. And that's where you see how people conduct themselves in their personal lives may be a little different from what we see them do publicly, and it's a tension they have in themselves. It's a struggle going on, and that's when I began to see how complicated a man Buckley was. I had gone into this project thinking he was a brilliant man, but he might not be all that complicated. Just as for a long time we thought Ronald Reagan wasn't really all that complicated. And now we know from recent work on him by Max Boot and others, he was a very complicated man with many different sides. And Bill Buckley was the same way. And when you start looking at the history that way, looking at politics through these multiple lenses, then you feel you know it better, but you can never really understand it. And sometimes I feel that's where we are now. We get some signals, we think we know where something's going, and then suddenly we don't. And that's what it's like to write these books. It's why it takes a long time to do it, too.
How do you understand Buckley's Catholicism as he works on his book, God and Man at Yale, in the early 1950s? We all know him as a conservative, but how did his faith inform his politics and ultimately his career, especially early on?
When Bill Buckley went to Yale in 1946, he'd served 2 years in the Army, and so he was part of the GI group that came in and hugely swelled the undergraduate population. So they couldn't even fit them in the dorms. So it's this kind of jostling new culture. He's sitting in a classroom, and he hears one of the most respected lecturers at Yale describing Catholicism, and in particular, Bob, the Eucharist, right? The wafer and the wine, as a superstition. And Buckley can't believe it. He's been raised as the most believing, devout Catholic. Someone who believes in the literal truth of transubstantiation, the Eucharist, the magic, as he calls it, that happens at the altar. And here is a professor kind of ridiculing it, and everyone in the class, in a classroom, almost as many people as we've got here in a lecture hall, are yucking it up. They think it's hilarious. And out of that, Buckley developed this idea that things are going on in these universities that the students might think are funny, but maybe their parents and the donors don't. Sound familiar? So he gets this idea that he can be a critic of the university. It's his Catholicism that makes it a real passion to do it. It's not just careerism. How can I write a book that's going to excite people or cause a controversy? It's how do I defend the principles I was raised on and that I really believe? And that's really the beginning, I think, of his conservative movement.
Help us get a better sense of Buckley's explosion on the American scene. He comes out with this book, God and Man at Yale. One, just how big was it as a cultural moment and as a bestseller? And how do we understand Buckley in that moment in the early 50s where Senator Joseph McCarthy is rising? Buckley's now a bestseller, a young man, and then by 1955, he decides to found National Review magazine. How did it all come together, all of these forces and people in the early 50s to give Buckley what you ultimately write about at length, his power in America?
Well, it was communism and anti-communism. That was the great theme. It was the great struggle of the time. And it was a cause of belief that many Americans shared. There was a spectrum of anti-communists. You could be a liberal. You could be a liberal Democrat and still be anti-communist. The communists had been the allies of the Nazis originally in World War II. They were creating a dictatorial regime under Stalin. There was a lot to fear in communism. Buckley combined that with Catholicism, and that's where we get this idea of atheistic communism. Buckley didn't invent that term. What he did was to bring cultural sophistication to it. So when Buckley talked about it, he talked at a higher level. He didn't just call people names. He said, here's where they are diverging from the higher truths we all believe in. It's a little closer to, say, George Orwell in 1984. And the inspiration for that book was one of Buckley's mentors, a great philosopher and thinker, James Burnham. Buckley surrounded himself with these older figures who had command of world history and experience, partly because they'd all been communists who changed their minds. So then Joe McCarthy comes along, and Buckley and others realize this is the guy who reaches the people. He's not just winning debates on a stage like this, which Buckley was very good at. He was a champion debater. He and his brother-in-law, Brent Bozell, who became a very famous conservative, and together they wrote a book defending Joe McCarthy. They could do that very well on the public stage, but Joe McCarthy could excite voters and watchers and listeners. I was surprised to see, Bob, when I was reading about the famous Army McCarthy hearings that brought Joe McCarthy down in 1954. At their peak, this is in a much smaller country when most people did not have a television set. You have to grasp that. You go to a bar to watch television. As many as 20 million people would watch Joe McCarthy in those hearings. It's a big chunk of the country was seeing him implode. So what Buckley thinks is, all right, he's a great populist, he's getting people excited, but he's not really going to succeed on the big stage. So that's when he starts his magazine to try to educate a new generation of conservative intellectuals and activists who could speak the same language that liberals did. Remember, these are the days, you know this, you're at CBS. There were 3 major television networks, right? Just 3, no cable television.
That's how it is now, right?
No cable television. There's really no talk radio. There are a couple of guys who go on the radio and have some audiences. There's certainly no social media, no internet. You reach people through print magazines. So you could start a small magazine, as Buckley did in 1955 at the age of 29, and call himself a radical conservative, which was the phrase he used, and you could build a movement out of it if you collected like-minded people around you and stayed true to the cause, while at the same time you gave them the freedom to think and interact freely so they could develop their arguments and ideas. And Buckley became kind of ringmaster. He knew where the talent was. He found younger writers who were even better than they were. Some of the most famous writers in America. Joan Didion was a book critic for National Review magazine under Bill Buckley in the late 1950s and early 1960s. The great Gary Wills, a historian, was discovered by Bill Buckley. He had a great ear for talent, eye for talent, and that's how he was going to build his movement, from the inside out. And that way, if he could, kind of conquer the media landscape. So Variety magazine, when Buckley got a position in the Nixon administration, called him the conservative man for all media. By this time, he's on television, he's doing radio, he's writing his columns, he's writing books. Bill Buckley wrote 50 books, in addition to everything else. He had a newspaper column in the days when people got their news through newspapers that was syndicated in more than 360 newspapers. So he himself had an audience in the tens of millions, but he never made it about himself. It was always about his ideas and his arguments. And it was his ability to kind of manage all that at once that made it a fascinating life to live and a really hard one to write about.
And there's so many different aspects to Buckley, and it's so interesting how you editorially decided with your book to focus. He had this long life, and you really focus on the 50s, the 60s in particular, the early 70s. But in the 1960s, he's opposing civil rights, but he also has this politics of joy when he runs for mayor of New York City in 1965. He's a key player with Barry Goldwater in 1964. Take us to the mid-60s. He's now been running National Review for about a decade. He's close to the Republican nominee for president, and he's running for mayor of New York City.
Bill Buckley and company had their first big victory in 1964 when an ideological conservative came from a part of the country that had a new name called the Sun Belt, and a Buckley protege, Kevin Phillips, came up with that term, coined it, broke through the established Republican Party, which, as you know, was based in the East Coast in those days. The Rockefellers and Deweys and Eisenhowers. They broke through with a radicalism that came out of the Sun Belt, the frontier. And then think of all the presidents who came out of that part of the country. Nixon, Reagan, both Bushes came from the Sun Belt. Buckley knew them all, was quite close to every one of them. He saw, after Goldwater's catastrophic defeat in 1964, they knew he was going to lose. President Kennedy had been assassinated. Lyndon Johnson was kind of taking on his mantle for the country. And he was a very effective legislative president, Lyndon Johnson. So they knew Goldwater was going to lose, but they had no idea how badly he'd be defeated. He won his own state and 4 or 5 others in the Deep South, and that was it for Goldwater. So the movement Buckley had built looked finished. And a guy interviewed for this book, someone well-known in Washington, who's quite a brilliant person, is Pat Buchanan. And Buchanan said at that stage, he was working for Nixon at this point, he said at that stage, all we had was Bill Buckley. Wow. Our political figures had been humiliated. Nixon had already been defeated for president once. He was defeated when he ran for governor of California in 1962. They had nobody. And Bill Buckley realized it was up to him. So he decides to run for mayor of New York. And I know many in the audience will be familiar with this exchange, but I like to repeat it anyway, just so you sort of hear it in real time. And I wish I could do voices, but I can't. But I can do words. I remember what he said. So Bill Buckley has his first press conference, Overseas Press Club, 1965. He's announcing he's running for mayor of New York. And everybody in New York knows him as a man about town, lives in a beautiful home with his beautiful socialite wife, and they have guests come over to play Bach on the piano, and he's hanging out with Andy Warhol and Truman Capote and Norman Mailer, and he doesn't want to look like a fool in front of his friends, right in front of his peeps. So somebody in the audience says, one of the newsmen says, Mr. Buckley, what are you going to do if you win? And Buckley says, demand a recount. And it comes so quickly and so smoothly that only later, when you do a little research, you realize that line was rehearsed. That the really good actors can make the line sound new every time. But that was Bill Buckley's way of saying, let's not take any of this too seriously. Yes, it's important. I'm running for mayor. And he also said, by the way, don't expect me to give a lot of speeches the way the opposition is, because I've got the sailing race from Nova Scotia to Annapolis, and that's going to take a couple of weeks of my time. And people began to realize it was welcome for someone to lighten the mood a little bit. And, well, what followed after that, Buckley lost, but he got just enough votes for close observers of the time. The great journalists Theodore White, Robert Novak, and Roland Evans wrote an important column together. They said, this guy's actually tapped into something that could work nationally. So Buckley then flies out to California to meet with another one of his many disciples and says to Ronald Reagan, yeah, I think you can run for governor and win. And writes the column that says, Ronald Reagan is going to surprise a lot of people. And that, because the thing had happened, Bob, the guy who was very brilliant in the milieu we've talked about, his kind of high society milieu, now he's going out to Queens and giving speeches. He's going out to Brooklyn. He's addressing black audiences. He's not afraid to talk to anybody, even though his views are quite conservative. He'll take anybody on. People told me this, Bob, I think it's really important. Face to face, Bill Buckley was an egalitarian. He might oppose every bit of progressive legislation that was coming down the pike, including the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act in the mid-1960s. But if you were a black leader like Jesse Jackson, whom he really liked, and he met him face to face, then you were his equal. If you would get on the stage and debate with him, you were his equal, and he would listen to you. It wasn't about scoring cheap points. It was actually listening to you, letting the country hear him. So all this started to happen. And it was after that mayoral campaign, which turned into a television competition because of a newspaper strike, that Buckley went on TV. And that's when he began captivating audiences because of that same wit he showed in the press conference. And that, as a result of that, they started his program Firing Line. And conservatives I've talked to from that era say the most important thing Bill Buckley did was to do that television program every week. Small market, PBS, not CBS like you.
That was PBS for 4 years.
That's right. He was great on PBS.
Okay.
We could, but very small audience, but they were the right people, and this was the important thing, most of them were liberals who were watching him. And so a friend of Buckley's told me, Ray Price, became a speechwriter for Richard Nixon. He said the best thing Bill Buckley did was to go in that program every Sunday and interview his guests, right? Usually a liberal whom he put in the firing line. And you watched him and you thought, this man is smarter than I am, Bill Buckley. He speaks better than I do. He's got a quicker wit. Maybe I should be listening to what he has to say. And that's when the movement rose another level and started connecting with people who were more in the middle.
And one final question for Sam here. If you people want to start lining up for questions, and we'll go to questions after this, my own question here. So the movement starts rising. Buckley's at the center of it in the mid to late 60s. Richard Nixon, running for president in 1968, wants Buckley as an ally. He wins in 68 and 72. Yet you write about how Buckley in the 60s has so much influence, and it paves the way for Ronald Reagan to win the White House in 1980. Yet once Reagan wins power, Buckley is sort of, in your assessment, yesterday's story.
Nixon needed Reagan. Nixon needed Buckley. Reagan didn't. Reagan was close to Buckley personally. He had, like most presidents, he had a very large ego. He didn't want the world to think that he was Bill Buckley's puppet, that Bill Buckley was giving him the words and arguments. Reagan was a little self-conscious. He was a brilliant actor, great script reader and writer.
Smarter than people think?
Much smarter than people think, and much shrewder. He read the end of the Cold War better than Buckley and company did. He saw that Gorbachev could be dealt with, and that a truce, the Cold War could be negotiated to a settlement. Reagan saw that. But he didn't need Buckley to validate him with a right. Nixon needed it. Nixon was never quite trusted by the hardline conservatives because Nixon had been vice president to Eisenhower, who was very much a centrist. So Buckley and others thought of Nixon as an opportunist. Reagan really was committed ideologically, but he was so charismatic a president. He won so overwhelmingly in 1980, and even more so than 1984, that he kind of gently pushed Buckley to the side. So Buckley became ever more famous and successful with his memoirs and his novels. Buckley was one of the few writers in America whose books alternated. When in the winter season, he would have his spy novel, his Blackford Oak spy novel that would be in the New York Times bestseller list. Then he would do a sailing memoir for the next season, and it would be on the nonfiction bestseller list. So Buckley had to space out his books so he wouldn't compete with himself. That's how successful and famous he was. But his influence was not as great as it had been before.
We'll now take some questions. We'll begin over here, then we'll go over here.
Hi, thanks so much for the conversation. It was really interesting. Who do you see as the standard bearer for Buckley's style of kind of intellectual patrician conservatism in this era of like very brash, in-your-face right-wing politics?
Can we have a security guard escort her out of the room? So they start with the tough one. At this point, I don't know, but here's what I would say. There's nobody like Buckley now, but there was nobody like him before then either. There are aspects of Bill Buckley, I think, that you can find in different figures in our landscape now. This will maybe surprise a lot of people, but somebody who has talents like Bill Buckley's is Tucker Carlson. He attracts audiences. He knows how to style his arguments in a way that people find as attractive. He doesn't have quite the ideology Buckley did, but he has some of Buckley's style. I don't think there's anyone who brings all those pieces together. And it's not because people don't want to, by the way. It's because our culture has changed. It isn't just 3 networks and 2 or 3 great newspapers, the Post, the Times, and the Wall Street Journal, that much of America reads. We have so diversified, or as Buckley would say, atomized a culture that it's hard for anyone to gather up all those strands. It doesn't mean it can't happen. I have a feeling it will be someone who comes out of the newer media and is able to reach broad audiences through it. We haven't quite seen it yet because this time is so polarized. Remember, too, in Buckley's era, it was a liberal world. The liberals dominated the world, our world, our cultural world. So for Buckley to make his way, he had to win liberal converts over. And that is something that I don't think politicians feel so much today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I hate to bring up this the name, but Donald Trump has been famous, New York City famous since at least the 70s and nationally famous since the 80s. And a lot of that time was spent being a cartoon figure, but a lot of it was also spent making political observations here and there. So what were Bill Buckley's thoughts on Donald Trump as he went in and out of the news, probably the last 30, 35 years of Buckley's public life? Thank you.
Well, that's a great question. One thing to remember, if you can turn your mind back a little ways, not that far, to the 2016 election, when the really remarkable Republican debates were being held on television. Does anybody remember the one where Ted Cruz went after Donald?
He's still in the Senate,
He's
Sam.
still in the Senate, yes. Anyway, and at that point, he was the strongest contender to Trump, strongest opposition. And he said, well, Donald, he said, you come from Manhattan, and there aren't a lot of conservatives in Manhattan. And Trump says, oh, yeah? What about William F. Buckley? I jumped out of my seat when I heard him say that. Because what it shows you is, one thing, Trump knew. He knew exactly who Buckley was. Now, Buckley did comment on Trump once publicly. It was, now this we'll see who the real wonks in the audience are. Anyone remember when Donald Trump first came very close to entering a presidential election as a candidate?
Well, 1987 and 1999.
Yeah, 1999, it was going to be the Reform Party ticket, and Ross Perot's ticket. And Buckley, this is classic Bill Buckley, was asked to assess him in Cigar Aficionado magazine, which I realize he did because they paid a lot of money to writers. And so Buckley wrote an article about several new political figures who seemed to be coming from nowhere, coming from the worlds of entertainment, but really attracting interest. So he began with the most important and successful of them all, who was, of course, Jesse Ventura, right, governor of Minnesota. Then he turns to Donald Trump. And he says, what do we know about Donald Trump? He says he's a businessman, and the country needs a businessman to run the country, to run the nation. And he says also, Trump reminds me of a Miss America beauty contestant who's always looking at himself in the mirror. He's a narcissist. And I did not include that in my book. So you're asked, why not? Well, my answer is, there were a lot of people saying things like that about Donald Trump in 1999 and 2000. We're saying it as late as 2015, but they weren't saying it later. So I didn't think that I could honestly, as a historian, say, and as someone who knew Bill Buckley extremely well, this is where Buckley would be on Donald Trump. I just don't know what he would have thought of him. He certainly would have recognized his talent. I think the political talent, Bob, you've followed it pretty closely. I think we all have to accept this. It's kind of late in the day not to accept just the size of Trump's talent as a politician, right? And I think Buckley would have seen that. Some of the policy he wouldn't have liked, but a lot of Republicans don't like President Trump's policy and still go along with him. So I just don't know what he would have had to say about him. One thing I'll add is Bill Buckley taped more than 1,500 episodes of Firing Line with his debate program, weekly debate program, with a very wide range of guests, from the poet Allen Ginsberg to the Black Panthers, Eldridge Cleaver and Bobby Seale. He had literary people on. He never had Donald Trump on. And I have a feeling if Trump had been asked, he would have appeared, he would have agreed to do it.
Very briefly, I know the flip side of this question a tad. In 2013, I interviewed Donald Trump when I was at National Review, and Trump starts talking to me about Bill Buckley. In 2013, he was going to Iowa because he was going to do something no one believed would happen, was thinking about running for president. This is in 2013. And Trump, I always remember, framed Buckley in our conversation as not someone he knew, but as a major figure of New York City in the 60s. And he mentioned Norman Vincent Peale, Roy Cohn, his friend, the lawyer. Buckley was this celebrity of New York, and those celebrities of New York of the 60s so hover over Trump and how he sees the world. And so he never really brought up, even when he was talking to National Review, Buckley as an ideologue or thinker. It was Buckley as a New Yorker, for what it's worth.
Very interesting. And that larger-than-life personality. Absolutely true. That's fascinating to hear. And by the way, the period Bob was talking about, 2013, that's 5 years after Buckley had died. Buckley died at the age of 82 in 2008. So he never saw this next wave of politics happen.
Yeah. Did Buckley change to any extent over time, over his whole career, but especially the latter parts of the career, in his, political opinions, policy positions, and so forth? And I think this is probably related. What was his relationship to the Republican Party, especially in the last decade or so, as so much has happened to, the Tea Party and of course the MAGA movement? So what does he talk about when he talks the Republican Party?
And repeat for me the first part of your question.
Just whether he has
or whether
changed.
he changed.
Yeah.
Yes, Buckley's politics, no one likes to hear this term. Ideological conservatives hate to use this word, but I'm going to use it anyway, is that Buckley grew over time. I've described Buckley the segregationist in the 1950s. Buckley in 1970 publicly wrote and said in interviews, this country needs a black president in 1980. That's quite a change. How did it happen? Because he met people. One of the surprises I found, and I think readers of the book are some of them are taken aback by this too, is although Buckley was brilliant and erudite, he was not someone with his nose in his book all that much, really. He learned from conversation and meeting people, actually the way politicians often do. And as he got to know more and more people outside his own limited sphere, he began rethinking. And civil rights, he realized, was the big mistake he and his side had made. in opposing the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. It's the one big error he owned up to. It's interesting you ask about the Republican Party, because he died in 2008, right before that Republican primary, which nominated John McCain, right, had begun. He actually kind of liked, I don't think he ever would have voted for her, but he was quite charmed by Hillary Clinton. Bill Buckley was a person guy, and if he liked the way you smiled, he liked the way you spoke, he'd be interested in you. The part of the Republican Party that he grew alienated from was over the Iraq War. And that's where he and Donald Trump, Bob, I think, would have seen eye to eye. Buckley had real doubts about the Iraq War. And that's where the party was pushed by the group called the neoconservatives. And Buckley was friendly with them, and everyone gets it. Neoconservatives were former liberals who moved right, moved to the center or moved to the right, partly because of cultural changes that they opposed, and also for foreign policy reasons. They were strongly anti-communist. Those of you, by the way, who were noticing what seems to be this kind of rethinking of what's called woke culture now, and people are changing their minds about it, that reminds me of the neoconservatives deciding they don't want to be leftists anymore and move to the center. So we don't know what Buckley would have made of that Tea Party movement that arose in 2010 through 2014. However, a lot of those early Tea Party people, the senior members, had been Goldwaterites in 1964. So I think he would have recognized the similarities there. What he would have made of the new MAGA movement, we don't know. Although I'll tell you this fact, the very first political movement Bill Buckley joined was the America First Committee that opposed intervention in World War II.
The Lindbergh Group?
The Lindbergh Group.
Buckley was part of that, that's right.
Yeah, Lindbergh was Buckley's first hero. The very first speech I found by Buckley, which is so precocious, if you were a parent, right, an adult who had a kid in his class, you'd say, where is that kid so I can strangle him? He's getting in the way of my child. He was that smart. It was a brilliant defense of Charles Lindbergh and the America First Committee and their opposition to World War II. So those elements of the movement he came back to. So it could be he would have been more at home in it than we might know.
We have time for one quick question over here and one quick question over here.
In 1965, Buckley debated James Baldwin at Cambridge, and my understanding it was a clear loss for Buckley. Do you agree with that? And more importantly, did that debate have any impact on Buckley?
Yes to both. So this is an interesting fact about Bill Buckley. He was commonly called the greatest debater of his time. He probably was. But the two most famous debates he had, he lost. One was to Gore Vidal during the 1968 presidential election, televised debates. And the first was to the quite amazing James Baldwin. That was in Cambridge University in 1965. And Buckley really wanted to debate Baldwin. He'd been kind of spoiling to go after him, and he had no idea what he was going up against. He knew Baldwin was a brilliant writer, and they were really debating the argument in Baldwin's famous essay that was published in book form, The Fire Next Time. And Buckley thought it was very anti-American and overly militant, and it seemed to be part of this extremism that was coming out of the culture then. And Buckley made the mistake at Cambridge University with an audience, I think, larger than this one. They had to open up special rooms and put TV cameras in them so everybody could watch. It was broadcast on BBC. And Baldwin delivered a really famous set of remarks that you can see now. You can go on YouTube, by the way, and see all these things. And Baldwin talked about the legacy and history of slavery and how it was a part of American capitalism. Those were really radical arguments to make then. They're not anymore. And Buckley didn't know what hit him. So the only thing Buckley could think to do was to go after Baldwin personally and say, in effect, this guy is speaking to you in a kind of pretend British accent. And anyone familiar with black history and black culture and the tradition of the minstrel shows and all of this knows how deep an insult that was. It was a huge miscalculation by Buckley, and the room turned against him. He lost the debate. But there's another aspect of the story, too. They were debating at the same moment, and remember, this is in Cambridge, England, but on the other side of the pond, black citizens in America are getting brutalized in the South by law enforcement because they're demanding their constitutional right to vote. And everyone in the world knew this was happening. The British themselves were undergoing a period of decolonization. So for Buckley to ridicule Baldwin in this public way was shocking. It cost him the debate really badly. But then there was a second debate in New York a few months later, and Buckley handled himself much better. It was more like this, two guys sitting in a chair. If anyone here remembers the old David Susskind television show, it was like Joe Rogan without the audience, because they'd go on for hours, and 3 hours sometimes, and it was Buckley and Baldwin going back and forth. And suddenly the playing field got leveled, and that was the debate that made Buckley decide he could run for mayor, because the arguments about race that seemed really clear-cut in the South got more ambiguous when you brought them north, because the issues changed. It's not about Jim Crow de facto segregation. It's about the changing nature of life in urban America, things that are actually happening still in our own time. So Buckley realized, he grew from that debate and modulated his argument, but yeah, he got his rear end kicked pretty hard. And later when he wrote a memoir about it, he was finally confessed, and he said, as soon as Baldwin started talking, he said, oh boy, this is a lost cause tonight.
We're a little over time, so quick question, quick answer.
It was actually about the other debate with Gore Vidal. I
Yeah.
saw that. There was a documentary on that a few years ago,
Yes.
Best of Enemies, and I saw that. And I just wondered what you thought of that debate and like the legacy that it had, how it impacted Buckley. And
Yeah, that was one of my favorite things in the book to write about. That is a really good documentary. Some people think I was involved in making it. I was not. I was a talking head. I was one of the people who talked on it. It had nothing to do with the making of that documentary. That was interesting because the famous exchange, the name-calling exchange between Buckley and Vidal, where, I'm just going to use the language because that was the language they used, where Vidal called Buckley crypto, proto-Nazi, and Buckley called Vidal a queer. In days when Vidal was not out of the closet, he's outing him on television, right? It was shocking when it happened, but if you look at the two men's faces, if you remember from the documentary, Vidal has a triumphant look on his face. He'd been pushing Buckley's buttons in the previous 10 debates, which you don't see so much about. They debated all the way through the Republican convention in Miami and then the Democratic one in Chicago. And at that point, again, Vidal got under Buckley's skin, is what he was able to do. I was interviewed by a journalist and writer I bet you many here know. I know Bob knows him. Andrew Sullivan is a brilliant writer and podcaster. And he said, and Andrew's gay, and he said when he read about that exchange in my book, and also when he watched it on television, which you can do, he said he sympathized with Buckley because Vidal was goading him the whole time. Even before that exchange, well before, Vidal had been insinuating that Buckley himself was gay. And he did it through kind of coded language. So he was really getting at him, and he got the reaction he wanted. Buckley was embarrassed about it for the rest of his life. Here he is, a great man of language and words, and these are the words he's remembered for, calling somebody a queer on television. He was not happy about that.
I'll sock you in your damn face or something.
Yeah, I'll sock you in your goddamn face and you'll stay plastered, he said, in that patrician accent of his. It was a bizarre moment in television. Today we wouldn't think twice about it, right? They say, oh, how genteel, you know. He didn't say, I'll kick you, you know where, you know. It's not.
At least he was wearing a tie.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. And a round of applause for Sam Tannenhouse.
Thank you very much. It was great fun.